Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. If these stories bring you comfort, you're welcome to subscribe and join us on these quiet journeys. Now it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The town of Greymore sat at the edge of England, where the land grew weary and gave itself to the sea. And in the winter months, it wore its cold beauty with a quiet dignity that asked nothing of visitors and promised little but shelter to those who called it home. The houses were built of grey stone, quarried from the cliffs to the north, their walls thick against the wind that came off the water, and their windows small and deep-set, glowing amber when the lamps were lit inside. Snow fell often in those months, not in great violent storms, but in soft, steady curtains that muffled the world and made the cobbled streets treacherous with their covering of white, and the harbour would fill with mist that rolled in from the dark water and clung to the masts of fishing boats and the iron railings along the quay. The town had grown up around the harbour over centuries, its streets climbing the hillside in narrow terraced rows, and at the highest point stood the church of St. Anselm, with its square tower of weathered stone that could be seen from the fishing grounds far out to sea. The church bell had rung out the hours for longer than anyone could remember, its voice deep and assured, a sound that shaped the days and gave them order, that told the fishermen when to return and the children when to come in from their play, that marked the passing of time in a place where time seemed to move at its own considered pace, unhurried by the urgencies that troubled the cities to the south. In a narrow shop on Chandler's Lane, halfway up the hill between the harbour and the church square, Edmund Hartley kept his trade as a clockmaker and repairer of timepieces, and had done so for the better part of 40 years. The shop was a small kingdom of ticking voices, each clock and watch keeping its own measure of the hours, some running a minute fast and others falling a minute behind, so that the shop itself existed in many times at once, a chorus of mechanical certainty that never quite agreed. The front window displayed 3 tall case clocks of dark walnut and mahogany, their brass faces gleaming in the gaslight, their pendulums swinging in stately rhythm behind glass doors. And behind them, on shelves that climbed to the ceiling, were carriage clocks and mantel clocks, pocket watches hanging on small brass hooks, and here and there the disassembled parts of broken timepieces, waiting for attention and the careful application of skill. Edmund himself was a man of 60 winters, his hair gone to silver and his back grown stiff from decades, bent over his workbench, his eyes sharp behind the spectacles he wore for close work, and his hands still steady when they held the tiny wheels and springs and escapements that made time visible. He had never married, had never found the inclination to share his ordered life with another, and his devotions were given to the mechanisms that measured and marked and kept faith with the turning of the earth, those patient constructions of brass and steel that asked only to be properly maintained and would, in return, give decades of faithful service. His apprentice, Samuel Merritt, was 19 years of age and had been learning the trade for 3 years now, coming each morning before the sun was properly up to sweep the shop and trim the lamps and begin the careful work of cleaning and adjusting and repairing that filled their days. Samuel was the youngest son of a widow who took in mending and lived in 2 rooms above a baker's shop near the harbour, and he had come to the clockmaker's trade not from any great passion for mechanisms, but from the simple need for honest work and the hope of learning a skill that might support him and his mother in the years to come. He was quiet by nature, given more to listening than to speaking, and he had the patience that the work required, the willingness to sit for hours with a magnifying glass and fine tools, removing a broken mainspring or truing a bent wheel tooth, never rushing, never forcing, letting the work reveal itself in its own time. The winter had come early that year, the first snow falling in the last week of November, and by the time December arrived, the town had settled into its cold weather rhythms, the fishing boats going out less frequently when the seas were rough, the women gathering in each other's kitchens to do their mending and preserving by the warmth of kitchen ranges, the men meeting in the 2 public houses near the harbour to smoke their pipes and speak of weather and catches and the small politics of a small place. The shops along the high street kept shorter hours, opening late and closing early, their proprietors content to tend their fires and serve the steady trickle of customers who needed tea or sugar or lamp oil or the services of the ironmonger or the draper. Edmund's shop kept to its routine, regardless of weather, opening at 8 in the morning and closing at 6 in the evening, 6 days each week, with Sundays reserved for rest and such church-going as conscience and habit demanded. The morning ritual never varied. Samuel would arrive first and unlock the door and light the lamps, then set about winding the various clocks that required daily attention, starting with the tall regulators and working his way through the smaller timepieces, each one receiving its prescribed number of turns of the key, neither more nor less. Then he would sweep the floor and dust the shelves, while Edmund prepared tea in the small room behind the shop, where he kept a spirit lamp and a kettle, and they would drink their tea together in companionable silence before beginning the day's work. Customers came and went throughout the days, bringing pocket watches that had stopped or run slow, carriage clocks that chimed at the wrong hours, and occasionally some more unusual mechanism, a music box with a damaged cylinder, an astronomical clock whose gears had seized, once even a delicate French automaton in the shape of a singing bird that had belonged to someone's grandmother, and now sat silent in its gilded cage. Edmund would examine each piece with grave attention, turning it in his hands, opening the case, studying the movement within, and then he would quote a price for the repair and a time for collection, and the customer would nod and leave the timepiece in his care, trusting that it would be restored to proper function. The work itself was conducted at 2 benches that faced the shop window, Edmund at the larger bench to the left and Samuel at the smaller one to the right, each with his own set of tools arranged in careful order, screwdrivers of various sizes, tweezers and pliers, files and burnishers, brass brushes and cleaning solutions, and the small brass oil cups that held the special oils used for different parts of a movement. The light from the window was good during the day, and when it faded, they worked by lamplight, the gaslight steady and bright, casting no shadows on the delicate work before them. On the morning of the 17th of December, which fell on a Tuesday that year, Samuel arrived at the shop to find that the town had changed in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. The snow had fallen again during the night, adding another few inches to the accumulated drifts, and the air was still and cold, the sky a pale grey that promised more snow before evening. He unlocked the shop and went about his morning tasks, lighting the lamps and beginning the winding of the clocks. But as he worked, he became aware of an absence, a missing element in the morning's texture that his mind could not quite identify. It was only when Edmund arrived, stamping the snow from his boots and unwinding the woolen muffler from his neck, that Samuel realized what was wrong. The church bell had not rung for the 7 o'clock hour, nor for the half hour that followed. The sound that had marked every morning of his life, that deep bronze voice calling from the tower on the hill, had fallen silent, and the silence it left behind was larger than he would have imagined possible. Edmund noticed it as well, pausing in the doorway with his hand still on the latch, his head tilted as though listening for something that should be there and was not. He said nothing for a long moment, and then he closed the door softly behind him and hung his coat on its peg and came into the shop, his expression thoughtful. "The bell has stopped," Samuel said, stating what was obvious but needed saying nonetheless. "Yes," Edmund replied, moving to the window and looking up the hill toward where the church tower rose above the rooftops. "I noticed it when I woke. The 6 o'clock was missing." They stood together in silence, and Samuel found himself straining to hear the sound that should have been there, the familiar marking of time that had shaped his days since childhood. The clocks around them continued their various tickings and chimings, but without the church bell above them all, the hours seemed less certain, the day less firmly anchored to the earth. "Someone will have noticed," Edmund said after a while. "The vicar, certainly. Perhaps there is some simple matter, a broken rope, or the clapper has come loose." But the day passed and the bell remained silent, and by evening, when they closed the shop, the absence had spread through the town like a fog, touching everything with uncertainty. The fisherman who came back with the tide looked up toward the tower and frowned. The women shopping at the butcher's and the greengrocer's spoke of it in low voices. The children playing in the church square threw snowballs at one another, but kept glancing toward the tower as though expecting it to speak at any moment. Samuel walked home that evening through streets that seemed somehow less familiar, without the bell's voice to orient them, and when he reached his mother's rooms above the baker's shop, he found her sitting by the stove with her mending. But her hands were still in her lap, and she was looking out the window toward the harbour, where the lamplighter was making his rounds, touching his taper to each street lamp in turn, small flames blooming in the gathering dark. "The bell is silent," she said when he came in, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that needed acknowledgement. "Yes," he said, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. "Since this morning." She nodded slowly, her worn hands returning to the shirt she was mending, her needle moving with the practiced rhythm of decades. She was a woman who had known much work and some sorrow. Having lost her husband to the sea when Samuel was still a boy, and she had raised 3 sons on her own, the 2 elder ones gone now to Liverpool to work in the shipyards, and only Samuel remaining with her in Greymore. She spoke little of hardship, considering it a common condition that required no particular comment, and she had taught her sons to do their work well and to keep their word and to treat others with the decency that all people deserved regardless of their station. They will find the trouble and mend it, she said after a while, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had seen many difficulties arise and be resolved in their time. Yes, Samuel agreed, though he wondered who among the townspeople would know how to mend a church bell if the problem proved to be more than a simple broken rope. The next day, the silence continued, and the day after that, and the town began to adjust itself to the absence as people will adjust to any change given time, though the adjustment was not comfortable and sat uneasily with those who had known the bell's voice their entire lives. The vicar, a spare man named Reverend Talbot, who had served the church for 15 years, made inquiries throughout the town seeking someone with knowledge of bells and bell mechanisms. But Greymore was not a large place, and such specialized knowledge was not readily available. The sexton, who normally rang the bell by pulling on the rope that hung down through the tower into the ringing chamber, reported that the rope seemed to move freely enough, but produced no sound, suggesting that the problem lay higher up, in the bell chamber itself, where the great bronze bell hung in its frame, or in the mechanism that caused the clapper to strike. On the Friday of that week, Reverend Talbot came to Edmund's shop in the late afternoon, the small brass bell above the door announcing his entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed almost mocking in the circumstances. He was a thoughtful man who chose his words carefully, and he stood just inside the door, removing his gloves and looking around at the many clocks with an expression of mild overwhelm, as though confronting for the first time the true multiplicity of measured time. "Mr. Hartley," he said when Edmund came from the back room to greet him, "I hope I am not interrupting your work." "Not at all, Reverend," Edmund replied, gesturing to a chair near the counter. "Please sit if you wish." But the vicar remained standing, turning his hat in his hands, and after a moment's hesitation, he explained the situation with the bell, speaking as though Edmund might not already know, which was the way of people when they came to ask for help. They needed to tell the story from the beginning to establish the context, even when the context was already well understood. "I wondered," he said when he had finished his explanation, "whether you might have some knowledge of such mechanisms. The bell has rung faithfully for 140 years, according to the church records, and I confess I do not know who might be able to repair it if the trouble is mechanical in nature." Edmund was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on the floor. Samuel, working at his bench, kept his attention on the carriage clock before him, but listened carefully to the conversation. "I have some knowledge of bells," Edmund said slowly. "The principles are not so different from those of clocks, a mechanism to measure movement, a striker to produce the sound. The scale is larger, of course, and the forces involved are greater, but the essential ideas are similar. Then you might be able to help." The vicar's voice carried a note of relief. "I might be able to examine it," Edmund said carefully. "Whether I can repair it would depend on what I find. But I confess, Reverend, that I am not certain I can make the climb to the bell chamber. The tower stairs are steep, and my joints are not what they once were." The vicar's face fell slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Of course. I should not have presumed. It is a difficult ascent, more than 100 steps, and narrow. There was a silence then, and Samuel felt both men's attention shift towards him, though neither looked at him directly. He kept his eyes on his work, removing the small screws that held the clock's back plate in place, his fingers steady despite the sudden awareness that a decision was being requested of him without words. "My apprentice is young and sound of limb," Edmund said at last. "If I were to examine the bell chamber myself, I would need to see it. But Samuel could make the climb and serve as my eyes and hands. I could instruct him on what to look for, what to test, what adjustments to attempt." Now both men did look at Samuel, and he set down his screwdriver and turned to face them, his expression calm, though his heart had begun to beat a little faster. He had never been inside the church tower, had never seen a bell mechanism, had no idea whether he would be able to understand what was wrong, much less repair it. But he had learned much about mechanisms in 3 years of apprenticeship, had learned how to observe carefully and think through problems methodically, and he trusted that Edmund would not send him to attempt something impossible. "I would be willing to try," he said, his voice steady. The vicar's face brightened considerably. "That is most generous of you, young man. When might you be able to examine it?" Edmund looked at Samuel. "Tomorrow is Saturday. We could close the shop early, say at 4 o'clock. That would give you the remainder of the afternoon to make your examination, and if the light is sufficient, you might begin the repair work. Otherwise, it would have to wait until Monday. Tomorrow would be most suitable," the vicar said. "I will ensure that the tower is unlocked and that you have light. We have lamps in the bell chamber that can be lit, and I will remain in the church below in case you need any assistance." And so it was arranged, and after the vicar had taken his leave, thanking them both several times over, Edmund and Samuel returned to their work, though now with an additional task ahead of them, one that felt weightier than the routine repairs that filled their ordinary days. That evening, Edmund kept Samuel at the shop after closing time, and together they reviewed the principles of bell hanging and bell striking, Edmund drawing diagrams on a sheet of paper to show how the bell was mounted in its frame, how the headstock and gudgeons allowed it to swing, how the clapper hung within and struck the sound bow when the bell was rung. He explained the wearing of bearings, the loosening of bolts, the various ways in which such mechanisms could fail, and he made Samuel repeat back to him what he had learned until he was satisfied that the young man understood not just the individual parts, but how they worked together as a system. "The most important thing," Edmund said as they finally prepared to leave for the night, "is to observe carefully before you act. Look at everything. Test the movement of all the parts. Try to understand what is preventing the bell from sounding before you attempt any repair. Many mistakes are made by people who begin taking things apart before they truly understand what is wrong." Samuel nodded, committing this advice to memory, along with everything else he had learned that evening. He walked home through the cold, dark streets, the snow crunching under his boots, and when he passed the church, he looked up at the tower and felt a small flutter of apprehension mixed with something else, a kind of anticipation, perhaps, or the simple awareness that he was being trusted with something that mattered to people beyond himself. Saturday dawned cold and clear, the sky a hard blue empty of clouds, the sun bright but providing little warmth. The shop was busier than usual with customers collecting repaired timepieces before the weekend or bringing in new work, and the hours passed quickly. At 4 o'clock, Edmund turned the sign in the window to closed and locked the door, and together he and Samuel walked up the hill to the church, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. The church of St. Anselm was built of the same grey stone as most of the older buildings in Greymore, its walls thick and solid, its windows narrow and filled with plain glass that let in light but offered no view of the world beyond. The interior was cold, but less so than the street, the air still and heavy with the scent of old wood and candle wax and stone. Reverend Talbot met them in the nave, his voice echoing in the empty space, and he led them to a small door in the northwest corner of the church, nearly hidden behind the font, which opened onto a narrow spiral staircase that climbed up into darkness. The stairs wind to the right, all the way to the bell chamber, the vicar explained, handing Samuel a lantern that had already been lit. There are 2 landings, one at the level of the organ loft, another at the clock room. The bell chamber is at the top. The lamps there are on a small shelf just inside the door. You will find matches beside them. Samuel took the lantern and tested its weight, then began the ascent, taking the stairs slowly, one hand on the rough stone wall to steady himself. Edmund and the vicar remained below, their voices fading as Samuel climbed higher, the stairway turning round and round, the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. He passed the first landing, where a door led out to the organ loft, and continued upward, the air growing colder as he rose, the walls pressing close on either side. The second landing opened onto a small room where the tower clock mechanism lived, its great weights hanging down through holes in the floor, its wheels and pinions turning with the steady patience that Edmund had taught him to recognize as the mark of good work. He paused there for a moment to examine it, seeing how the escapement controlled the descent of the weights, how the motion was transmitted through the gear train to the hands on the clock faces that showed on all 4 sides of the tower, and he felt a small comfort in recognizing something familiar before continuing to the unknown territory above. The final section of stairs was steeper and narrower than what had come before, and Samuel had to duck his head to avoid striking the stone ceiling. Then he emerged at last into the bell chamber, and he held his lantern high to see what lay before him. The chamber was square and open on all 4 sides, with tall arched openings that let in the wind and snow, and in the center of the space hung the bell itself, a great bronze shape dark with age, suspended from a massive wooden frame by iron fittings that looked as old as the tower itself. The bell was perhaps 5 feet tall and as wide at the mouth, its surface decorated with raised letters and designs that were difficult to read in the lantern light. Below it, hanging from a bolt that passed through its crown, was the clapper, an iron shaft as thick as Samuel's wrist with a heavy ball at its end, positioned to strike the sound bow when the bell swung. Samuel set his lantern on the floor and found the shelf with the additional lamps, lighting 3 of them and placing them around the chamber to provide better illumination. Then he began his examination, starting with the framework and working his way inward, checking each joint and bolt, testing the movement of the headstock that held the bell, running his hands over the gudgeons that served as its pivots. Everything seemed solid enough. The wood of the frame dark with age but sound, the ironwork rust-spotted but intact. He grasped the wooden wheel that protruded from one side of the headstock and pulled on it, testing the bell's movement, and it swung easily enough, rocking back and forth with a ponderous grace. But when it swung, no sound came forth, only a dull thud as the clapper struck the bronze. Samuel climbed up onto the frame itself, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the balance, and examined the clapper more closely. And here he found the problem. The bolt that secured the clapper to the crown of the bell had worked itself partially loose, allowing the clapper to hang at a slight angle, and the ball at its end, which should strike the sound bow cleanly, was instead hitting the bell at an oblique angle, making contact but without sufficient force to produce the proper resonance. The sound was being absorbed rather than projected. The bell's voice strangled before it could fully form. He climbed down from the frame and sat on the floor for a time, thinking through what would be required to fix the problem. The bolt would need to be tightened, but to reach it, he would have to climb up inside the bell itself and work in a cramped space with limited light and limited movement. It was not a difficult repair in principle, but the execution would require care and patience and a certain comfort with heights and enclosed spaces. He descended the tower stairs to where Edmund and the vicar waited in the nave, and he explained what he had found, describing the loose bolt and the angled clapper and the solution that presented itself. Edmund listened carefully, asking several questions to ensure he understood the situation correctly, and then he nodded slowly. "The repair is straightforward," he said, "but you will need to work carefully. The clapper is heavy. If you disturb it too much while working on the bolt, it could swing and strike you." "I understand," Samuel said. "You will need a wrench or spanner of appropriate size," Edmund continued. "Likely something quite large, given the age and scale of the mechanism. And you may need leverage, a length of pipe or a bar of some kind." The vicar, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "The sexton keeps tools in a shed behind the church. I'm certain we can find what you need." They went together to the small stone shed, where the sexton stored his various implements, shovels and rakes, a wheelbarrow, a collection of tools for maintaining the churchyard and the building itself. And after some searching, they found a large adjustable spanner and a steel pry bar, both showing signs of age and use, but serviceable nonetheless. Samuel tested the weight of each, judging whether he could manage them while working in the confined space of the bell chamber, and decided they would suffice. "I should begin now," he said, looking at the sky beyond the churchyard, where the light was already beginning to fade. "If I wait until Monday, the days will be shorter still." Edmund looked as though he wanted to object, to suggest that the work could wait, but after a moment he simply nodded. "Work carefully. Do not rush. If the light fails before you finish, leave it and return on Monday." Samuel climbed the tower stairs again, carrying the tools wrapped in a piece of canvas to prevent them striking against the stone walls, and when he reached the bell chamber, he set them on the floor and stood for a time looking at the bell, considering the best way to approach the work. The light coming through the arched openings was growing golden and slant, the sun somewhere behind the buildings to the west, and the air had grown even colder, his breath visible in the lamplight. He could hear the sounds of the town below, the distant calls of children playing, the creak of cartwheels on cobblestones, the crying of gulls near the harbour, and above these sounds the wind moving through the openings, a low voice that had no words, but seemed to speak nonetheless of cold and vastness and the indifference of winter. He removed his coat, folded it, and set it aside. He would need freedom of movement more than warmth. Then he climbed back onto the frame and positioned himself next to the bell, examining the crown where the bolt passed through. The headstock held the bell in a slightly tilted position, and to reach the bolt, he would need to lean forward into the bell itself, working with his arms extended above his head in a space barely large enough to admit his body. He took the spanner and the pry bar and climbed carefully onto the lip of the bell, then lowered himself down into its interior, the bronze cold against his hands, the space darker than he had expected despite the lamps. He could see the bolt now directly above him, a massive piece of ironwork thick with rust and old grease, the threads visible where it emerged from the crown. He fitted the spanner onto the nut and pulled, testing its resistance, and found that it was seized tight, unwilling to turn. For the better part of an hour he worked at it, applying steady pressure, tapping the spanner gently with the pry bar to jar the rust loose, resting when his arms grew tired, and then resuming. The cold settled into his bones, and his hands grew numb despite his efforts, and several times he nearly lost his grip on the tools. But he continued with the patience that Edmund had taught him, never forcing, never hurrying, letting the work happen at its own pace. The light outside faded to purple and then to dark, and the lamps cast strange shadows on the bronze around him. But gradually he felt the nut begin to move, just slightly at first, a minute fraction of a turn, and then more freely as the rust gave way and the threads began to engage properly. He turned it carefully, watching the clapper shift as the bolt tightened, bringing the heavy ball back into proper alignment with the sound bell. And when he judged it sufficiently secure, he climbed out of the bell and tested the movement again, pulling on the wheel to make the bell swing. This time, when the clapper struck, there was a sound that started deep in the bronze and swelled outward, filling the chamber with a richness that made the stone walls seem to vibrate, and the sound poured out through the arched openings and down over the town, a voice that had been silent for a week now speaking again with all its old authority. Samuel stood very still and listened as the sound faded, and then he pulled on the wheel again, and again the bell sang, and he felt something in his chest that might have been satisfaction, or might have been something simpler. The pleasure of work completed, of a problem solved, of trust justified. He waited for the sound to fade completely, and then he gathered his tools and his coat and descended the tower stairs, taking them slowly in the darkness, one hand on the wall and the other holding the lantern. And when he emerged into the nave, he found that it was not empty as he had expected. A dozen people stood in the pews, townspeople who had been walking past or sitting in their homes when they heard the bell ring again, and they had come to the church to confirm what their ears told them, to see with their own eyes that the voice had returned. Edmund was there, standing near the font, and Reverend Talbot beside him, and Samuel's mother wrapped in her shawl, and the baker from the shop below her rooms, and several fishermen still in their working clothes, and the lamplighter with his taper and pole. And they all turned to look at Samuel as he came down from the tower, and no one said anything for a long moment. And then his mother smiled at him, and the baker nodded, and one of the fishermen said simply, "Well done, lad." and that seemed to be enough. Reverend Talbot came forward and shook Samuel's hand, his grip firm and warm. "Thank you," he said. "You have restored something precious to us all." Samuel felt his face grow warm and looked down at his feet. "It was only a loose bolt," he said. "Nothing difficult." "Perhaps," the vicar replied, "but it needed to be found and repaired nonetheless, and you have done that service. The town is grateful." They left the church together, stepping out into the cold night where the stars were bright and hard in the black sky. And as they walked down the hill, the bell rang again, the sexton having climbed the tower to test it properly, and the sound rolled out over the rooftops and down to the harbour and out across the dark water. And Samuel thought that he had never heard anything quite so beautiful as that deep bronze voice speaking to the night. The days that followed were quieter, the town settling back into its rhythms now that the bell had returned. And Samuel went back to his work at the bench in Edmund's shop, repairing pocket watches and cleaning clock movements, the tower and its bell becoming just another part of the landscape of memory, rather than something present and demanding. But people noticed him differently now, nodding to him in the street, the women in the shops remembering his name, the vicar pausing to speak with him when they passed in the church square. And Samuel understood that something had shifted in the way the town regarded him, that he had moved from being simply the clockmaker's apprentice to being someone who had done a particular thing that mattered, and that this mattered in ways that were difficult to articulate, but nonetheless real. His mother said little about it, but she held herself a bit straighter when they walked together, and she mentioned once in passing that Mrs. Hadley, who kept the draper's shop, had said what a fine thing it was that Samuel had repaired the bell, and how lucky the town was to have such capable young people. And Samuel knew that this represented a kind of pride that his mother would never express directly, but that lived nonetheless in the careful way she folded his shirts and mended his socks and prepared his meals. Edmund, too, said little, but his manner toward Samuel gained an additional quality of regard, a recognition of capability that went beyond the apprentice relationship. And one morning, in the week before Christmas, he set a new carriage clock on Samuel's bench, a complicated mechanism with calendar wheels and moon phase complications. And he said simply, "I think you are ready to attempt this on your own. Come to me if you have questions, but I believe you have learned enough to work through it yourself." Samuel accepted the challenge and bent himself to the work, taking the clock apart with care and cleaning each piece and studying the gear train and the complications. And over the course of several days, he repaired it and reassembled it and set it running. And when Edmund examined his work, he nodded slowly and said, "Yes, that is done properly. Very good." Christmas came with more snow, and the town decorated itself modestly for the season. Pine boughs over doorways and candles in windows, and the church was fuller than usual on Christmas morning, the bell ringing out across the white rooftops to call the faithful to worship. Samuel sat with his mother in a pew near the back, the stone walls around them thick and cold, but the air warmed slightly by the presence of so many bodies. And when Reverend Talbot spoke of light coming into darkness and hope being restored, Samuel thought of the bell chamber and the work of his hands and the way that small acts of repair could matter more than the person doing them might imagine. The winter wore on through January, the days slowly growing longer, though the cold remained fierce, and the patterns of life in Greymore continued as they always had. The fishing boats going out when weather permitted, the shops opening and closing, the lamps being lit each evening along the harbour front, and in the streets climbing the hill. The church bell marked the hours faithfully, its voice carrying across the town, and people went about their business with the assurance that time was being properly kept, that the day was divided into its ordained sections, that the world continued to turn in its measured way. In the second week of January, Reverend Talbot came again to the clockmaker's shop, and this time he brought a different concern. The tower clock, which showed on 4 faces looking out over the town, had begun to run fast, gaining several minutes each day, so that by the end of a week it was noticeably ahead of the other timepieces in the town, and causing some confusion among those who relied on it. Edmund and Samuel climbed the tower stairs together this time, Edmund moving slowly and stopping frequently to rest, but determined to examine the mechanism himself. They stood in the clock room, studying the great wheels and pinions, the escapement that controlled the rate of the clock's running, and after some examination, Edmund determined that the crutch that connected the pendulum to the escapement had been bent slightly, probably by accident during some past maintenance, and this was causing the pendulum to swing with too short a period, making the clock run fast. "The repair is delicate," Edmund said, pointing to the bent section. "The crutch must be straightened, but not too much. If it is bent beyond true, it will break, and then we would need to have a new one made, which would take weeks and considerable expense." Samuel studied the mechanism, seeing how the crutch wire descended from the escapement to catch the pendulum rod on each swing, and he understood that the straightening would need to be done with great care, applying pressure gradually and testing the result frequently. "I could attempt it," he offered, "if you will tell me exactly how much to bend it and when to stop." Edmund considered this, his hand on the pendulum bob, and then he nodded. "Very well, I will steady the pendulum while you work. Heat the wire gently first. We have a small spirit lamp in the shop that would suffice. Warm it, but do not make it red hot. Then apply pressure slowly, and I will tell you when it is correct." They descended to the shop to fetch the lamp and returned to the clock room, and for the better part of an hour, Samuel worked at the task, heating the wire and bending it, fraction by fraction, with Edmund observing and instructing, and at last the old clockmaker was satisfied that the crutch was true. They started the pendulum swinging again and watched the escapement for several minutes, counting the ticks, and Edmund took a pocket watch from his waistcoat and timed it carefully. "There," he said at last, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "That is correct. Well done." They descended the tower stairs together, Edmund gripping the rail and moving carefully, and when they reached the bottom, he sat on a bench near the font to catch his breath, and Samuel sat beside him, and they remained there in the quiet of the church for several minutes, neither speaking, simply resting in the stillness that churches seem to hold even when empty. "You have learned the trade well," Edmund said at last, his voice soft in the cold air. "Better than I expected when you first came to me 3 years ago. You had patience then, but patience alone is not enough. You have developed judgment as well, and that is what makes the difference between a competent workman and a true craftsman. Samuel did not know how to respond to such praise, so he said nothing, but he felt the words settle into him like warmth, like something he could carry forward into the years ahead. They walked back to the shop through streets where the snow had been packed down by foot traffic into hard rutted ice, and the afternoon light was already fading, though it was not yet 4 o'clock. The winter days were short this far north, the sun rising late and setting early, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, held back only by the small warm lights of lamps and fires in windows. The shop felt especially warm after the cold of the tower and the streets, and they shed their coats and returned to their benches, and Samuel worked on a small bracket clock that needed a new mainspring, while Edmund examined a pocket watch that had been brought in that morning, its balance staff broken, a repair that would require making a new part on the small lathe that Edmund kept in the back room. The days proceeded in this fashion through the remainder of January and into February, the work steady if not abundant, the winter maintaining its grip on the town with cold winds and occasional snow, and the harbour often grey with mist. The fishing boats went out less frequently now, the men saying that the winter fish were scattered and difficult to find, and some families began to feel the pinch of reduced income, the women stretching their supplies of flour and tea and making do with less. Samuel's mother continued her mending work, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency through the dim hours of afternoon, and Samuel brought home his wages each week and placed them in the old tea tin where she kept the household money, and they managed well enough, better than some. The clockmaker's trade being one that continued regardless of fishing catches or weather, people always needing their timepieces kept in order. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-February, when rain was falling instead of snow and the streets ran with dark water, a man came into the shop whom Samuel had not seen before. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in the sturdy clothes of a working man, but clean and well kept, and he carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth which he set carefully on the counter. "Mr. Hartley?" he asked, looking at Edmund. "Yes," Edmund replied, setting down the pocket watch he had been examining. "How may I help you?" The man unwrapped his bundle and revealed a clock of unusual design, smaller than a mantel clock, but larger than a carriage clock, its case made of brass that had tarnished to a dark golden color. The face was white enamel with Roman numerals, and there were several small dials within the main dial showing various complications: a date wheel, a seconds indicator, and what appeared to be a tidal calculator. "This belonged to my grandfather," the man said. "He was a ship's captain, and he brought this back from Hamburg many years ago. It has not run since he died, and I would like to have it repaired if possible. My daughter is to be married in May, and I thought to give it to her as a wedding gift." Edmund took the clock in his hands and turned it slowly, examining the case and the dial, and then he opened the back and looked at the movement within. Samuel came over to look as well, peering over Edmund's shoulder at the intricate mechanism with its additional gearing for the complications. "This is fine work," Edmund said after a moment. "German craftsmanship, probably from the 1840s or thereabout. The movement is more complex than most clocks of this size." "Can it be repaired?" the man asked, his voice carrying a note of hope mixed with apprehension. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying the mechanism, and then he set the clock on the counter and looked at the man directly. "I believe it can, but the work will be extensive. The mainspring is broken, several pivots are worn and will need to be replaced, and the complication gearing will need to be cleaned and adjusted. It is perhaps 3 weeks of work, maybe more. The cost will be considerable." The man nodded slowly. "How much?" Edmund named a figure, and Samuel saw the man's face tighten slightly, but after a moment, he nodded again. "That is fair for such work. I have been saving money for the wedding gift. This is what I want to give her. Something that belonged to her great-grandfather, something that will last." "Then I will undertake the work," Edmund said. "Come back in a month's time, and I will have it ready for you." The man shook Edmund's hand and thanked him and left the shop, and Edmund stood looking at the clock for a long time, his expression thoughtful. "This will be good work," he said at last, speaking as much to himself as to Samuel. "Difficult, but satisfying. The kind of work that reminds you why you learned the trade in the first place." He carried the clock to his bench and began the process of disassembly, removing the hands and dial, taking out the movement, beginning the careful documentation of how each piece connected to the others so that he would be able to reassemble it correctly when the time came. Samuel returned to his own work, but found himself glancing over at Edmund's bench frequently, watching the old clockmaker work, seeing the care with which he handled each piece, the attention he gave to understanding the mechanism before attempting any repair. Over the following weeks, the German clock became the central work of the shop, Edmund spending hours each day on it, fabricating new pivots on the lathe, cleaning each wheel and pinion, testing and adjusting the complicated gearing that drove the tidal calculator. Samuel was given more of the routine repair work to manage on his own, freeing Edmund to focus on the difficult restoration, and Samuel found that he was capable of handling most of what came in: pocket watches with broken mainsprings, carriage clocks that needed cleaning, a tall case clock whose weights had fallen and damaged the movement. The weather began to change as February moved toward March, the days growing noticeably longer, the sun stronger when it broke through the clouds, and the snow that had covered everything since November began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath and the grey cobblestones of the streets. The fishing boats went out more regularly now, and the catches improved, and there was a sense throughout the town of winter's grip loosening, of spring approaching even though it had not yet arrived. On a Saturday afternoon in early March, Samuel walked through the town running errands for the shop, collecting a shipment of mainsprings that had come on the morning coach, taking several repaired watches to their owners, stopping at the ironmonger's to purchase some small files that Edmund needed. The air was milder than it had been in months, and people were out in greater numbers, the women shopping at the market stalls that had been set up in the church square, the children playing in the streets, their winter coats unbuttoned, their voices loud with the freedom of warmer weather. He stopped at the baker's shop to bring some bread up to his mother, climbing the narrow stairs to her rooms, and found her at the window looking out over the harbour where the fishing boats were returning with the afternoon tide, their sails bright against the grey water. "The winter is ending," she said when he came in, not turning from the window. "I can feel it in the air." "Yes," he agreed, setting the bread on the table. "Another month and spring will be properly here." She turned then and looked at him, and he saw something in her expression that might have been pride, or might have been simple love, the kind that mothers hold for their children, regardless of what those children do or become. "You have done well this winter," she said. "The vicar mentioned to me last Sunday that the bell rings as true as it ever has, and Mr. Hartley told Mrs. Hadley that you are becoming a fine craftsman. These things matter, Samuel. They are noticed." Samuel felt his face warm and looked down at his hands. "I only did what needed doing." "Yes," his mother said, "but you did it well, and that is what matters. Your father would have been proud of you." They stood in silence for a moment, and Samuel thought of his father, whom he could barely remember, a large presence and a deep voice and the smell of salt and tar, and then gone, taken by the sea in a winter storm, when Samuel was only 6 years old. He had learned to live with that absence, as his brothers had, as his mother had, but it remained nonetheless, a hollow place that could never be properly filled. "I should get back to the shop," he said after a moment. "Mr. Hartley will be closing soon, and I promised to help him move some of the heavier clocks that need attention." His mother nodded and touched his arm briefly, a gesture that said more than words, and he left and descended the stairs and walked back up the hill to Chandler's Lane, where the shop stood with its window full of clocks, all of them ticking, all of them marking time in their various voices. The German clock was completed in the last week of March, Edmund spending an entire day on the final adjustments and testing, making certain that all the complications ran correctly and that the tidal calculator matched the actual tides in the harbour. When he was satisfied, he called Samuel over to look at it, and together they wound it and set it running, and watched the various hands and indicators move through their appointed paths. "This is what the work is about," Edmund said quietly, "taking something that was broken and silent and making it speak again, restoring function and beauty both. This clock will run for another 100 years if it is properly maintained, and it will carry with it the memory of the man who owned it and the daughter who receives it, and all the moments it measures in the years to come." Samuel nodded, understanding that Edmund was speaking of something larger than just the clock before them, that he was articulating a philosophy of craft that went beyond mere technical skill, to touch on questions of purpose and meaning and the ways in which human hands could shape the world for good. The man came to collect the clock on the appointed day, and when Edmund presented it to him, running and true, showing the correct time and date and tidal phase, the man's eyes grew bright, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak his thanks. He paid the agreed sum without complaint, and left carrying the clock wrapped carefully in its oilcloth, and Edmund and Samuel watched him go. And then Edmund said simply, "That is a good day's work," and they returned to their benches and the routine repairs that awaited them. April came with warmer winds and rain instead of snow, the hills around Greymore turning green, the trees in the churchyard showing the first small leaves, and the harbour was busy with boats preparing for the spring fishing, the nets being mended and the hulls being painted and the rigging being checked and adjusted. The town seemed to wake from its winter sleep, people moving more quickly in the streets, the shops staying open later, the sound of hammering and sawing coming from the boatyard near the harbour where new vessels were being built. Samuel continued his work at the shop, his skills growing with each passing week, Edmund entrusting him with more difficult repairs and more valuable timepieces, and occasionally someone would mention the bell tower or the tower clock, and Samuel would simply nod and say it was nothing difficult, though he carried the memory of those winter evenings in the tower like something precious, a time when he had been trusted with something that mattered and had proven himself capable. One evening in late April, walking home through the soft spring twilight, he passed the church and heard the bell ring for the hour, its voice carrying across the town as it had for 140 years. And he paused to listen, counting the strokes, 8 o'clock, and he thought about how many people over how many years had heard that same voice marking the passage of time, and how each of them had lived their lives in the intervals between the ringing, and how the bell would continue long after he was gone, and he found comfort in that continuity, in being part of something larger than himself. He continued on to his mother's rooms, climbing the familiar stairs, and found her preparing their evening meal, a simple stew made from vegetables and a bit of mutton. And they sat together at the small table and ate in comfortable silence. And outside the window, the light faded slowly from the sky, and the lamplighter made his rounds, and the town settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. May brought the wedding for which the German clock had been restored, and Samuel heard from the baker that it had been much admired, that the bride's father had told the story of its repair, and how it had come from Hamburg with his grandfather all those years ago, and Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his teacher's skill had contributed to that young woman's happiness on her wedding day. The spring fishing was good that year, the boats returning with full holds, and the town prospered modestly, the shops doing better business, people having a little more money to spend on things beyond simple necessities. Edmund received several commissions for new clocks, people wanting to mark special occasions or replace old timepieces that had finally worn beyond repair, and he and Samuel worked long hours to meet the demand, the shop filling with the sound of files and hammers and the steady ticking of works in progress. On a morning in mid-May, Edmund called Samuel to his bench and showed him a letter he had received from the Clockmakers' Guild in London, informing him that his apprentice Samuel Merritt had completed the required years of training and had demonstrated sufficient skill to be examined for journeyman status. The examination would take place in August in London, and if Samuel passed, he would be certified as a journeyman clockmaker, able to work independently or establish his own shop if he chose. Samuel read the letter twice, the words not quite making sense at first, and then he looked at Edmund and saw that the old man was smiling slightly, a rare expression on his usually serious face. "I submitted your name last autumn," Edmund said. "I did not mention it because I wanted to be certain you were ready, and I wanted you to focus on the work itself rather than worrying about examinations. But I believe you are ready now. You have the skill and the understanding and the judgment that the work requires." "Thank you," Samuel said, and the words seemed inadequate for what he was feeling. But Edmund simply nodded and waved his hand as though dismissing the gratitude. "You have earned it through your own efforts. I have merely provided the opportunity and the instruction. The rest was your doing." The summer passed in a kind of suspended anticipation, Samuel continuing his work at the shop, but aware that in August everything might change. that he might return from London as something different than he was now, that he might have choices and possibilities that had not existed before. He tried not to think about it too much, tried to focus on each task as it came, each watch and clock requiring his attention. But the awareness remained like a distant light on the horizon, drawing him forward. In the first week of August, he took the coach to London, a journey of 2 days, with an overnight stop at an inn in a market town, whose name he immediately forgot. London was vast and noisy and overwhelming after the quiet of Greymore, the streets crowded with carriages and carts and people hurrying in all directions, the air thick with smoke and dust, and the smell of horse dung and humanity pressed together. The examination took place in a workshop belonging to the guild, a large room filled with workbenches and tools and a dozen other young men who had come from various towns and cities to be tested. They were given broken timepieces to repair, mechanisms to assemble from parts, problems to diagnose and solve, and examiners watched them work and asked questions and made notes on clipboards. Samuel worked methodically, drawing on everything Edmund had taught him, taking his time, observing carefully before acting, and when he was finished, he felt neither confident nor uncertain, simply empty, the way one feels after a great effort that has demanded everything and left nothing in reserve. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the inn where he was staying, informing him that he had passed the examination and was now certified as a journeyman clockmaker, and he stood in his small room holding the paper and felt something release in his chest, some tension he had been carrying for months without quite realizing it. He returned to Greymore on a bright August afternoon, the coach pulling into the inn yard near the harbour, and he walked up the hill to Chandler's Lane with his small bag and his certificate tucked safely in his coat pocket. And when he entered the shop, Edmund looked up from his bench, and their eyes met, and nothing needed to be said. That evening they closed the shop early and walked to the public house near the harbour, and Edmund bought a round of ale and told the men gathered there that his apprentice had passed his journeyman examination in London, and the men raised their glasses and drank to Samuel's health. And someone said he had always known the lad would make something of himself, and Samuel sat quietly and accepted their congratulations and felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with belonging. The years that followed were good ones, Samuel continuing to work with Edmund, but now as a journeyman rather than an apprentice, their relationship shifting subtly toward something more equal, more collegial, though Edmund remained. The master and Samuel respected that without question. They took on more complex work as Samuel's reputation grew, people coming from neighbouring towns to have their valuable timepieces repaired by the shop on Chandler's Lane, and the business prospered in its modest way. Edmund grew older, as all people do, his hands losing some of their steadiness, his eyes growing weaker despite the spectacles he wore, and gradually he turned more of the difficult work over to Samuel, sitting at his bench and observing and offering advice, but letting the younger man's hands do what his own could no longer do with the same precision. Samuel's mother passed away in the winter of his 25th year, quietly in her sleep, and he mourned her as sons do, and buried her in the churchyard under the shadow of the tower where the bell rang as it had rung at her birth and her wedding and all the days of her life. Edmund came to the funeral, and most of the town, for she had been well liked and respected, as a woman who had known hardship and met it with dignity and raised good sons who honored her memory. In time, Samuel met a young woman named Sarah, who worked in her family's chandlery near the harbour, and they courted with the slow, careful attention that people gave to such matters in those days. And eventually, they married in the church of St. Anselm, with the bell ringing out across the town, and they set up housekeeping in rooms not far from the shop, and their lives settled into patterns that felt both new and as old as time itself. Edmund continued working into his 70s, though at a slower pace, and Samuel knew that one day the shop would be his alone, and the thought brought both satisfaction and a touch of sadness, for he had come to love the old man as much as he respected him, and the prospect of continuing without him seemed somehow incomplete. But all of this was still in the future on that spring evening in May, when Samuel walked home through the soft twilight after the long winter had finally released its hold on Greymore, and the bell in the tower rang out the hour, and he stood listening as he had stood so many times before, counting the strokes, marking time, and feeling himself to be exactly where he was meant to be, doing the work he was meant to do in the place where he belonged. The sea wind moved through the streets, carrying the salt smell of the harbour, and the lamps were being lit one by one, small flames blooming in the gathering dark. And somewhere in the town, a mother was calling her children home to supper, and somewhere a fisherman was mending his nets by lamplight, and somewhere an old woman was saying her prayers before climbing into bed, and all of them moved within the sound of the bell, that deep bronze voice that had marked their days and would continue marking days long after they were gone, that steady, patient keeping of time that asked nothing and gave everything, and connected each moment to all the moments that had come before and all the moments yet to come. Samuel reached his mother's rooms and climbed the stairs, and inside the warm, small space, he found her at her usual place by the stove, her hands moving with their practiced rhythm through her mending, and he sat down across from her, and they talked of small things, the weather turning, the fishing improving, a wedding planned for June, and outside the window the light faded slowly from the sky, and the first stars appeared, cold and distant and eternal, and the clock on the mantel ticked steadily onward, marking time, keeping faith, and in the quiet of that room all seemed well with the world, all seemed as it should be, and Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and simply listened to the sound of his mother's breathing and the ticking of the clock and the distant voice of the bell, and he thought that this was enough, that this was everything, that this was what it meant to be home,